Ruth, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to all women, no matter what kind of denomination or seekers. Welcome to a new session of the Women of the Bible Speak. Yesterday, I did Tamar, an outsider, as also now I'm going to talk about Ruth, who was also an outsider. This is your Pastor Yeti. Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 to 4 and verse 22. Many of us are familiar with the story of Ruth. It's a beautiful story about three women. You can see it as a very beautiful and very difficult in this time frame for an immigration process. So, after all, Ruth is something of a superstar. A woman who has her own book in the Bible. In fact, Ruth is the only non-Jewish woman to have a book of the Bible named after her. Ruth is marked as an outsider from the very beginning of her story, like Tamar. She wasn't a descendant of Abraham. She was a woman of Moab, the land on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea, across from Judea. She married a young Jewish man named Machlon, whose family had fled a disastrous famine in Judea and gone looking for a better life elsewhere. But tragedy followed the family. Her father-in-law, Elimelech, died shortly after the family arrived in Moab. Sometime after that, both her husband and his brother, Chilion, also died. Along with her sister-in-law, Orpah, and her mother-in-law, Naomi, Ruth became part of a grieving trio. Three women bound together in heartbreak with limited prospects for the future. The famine in Judea having ended, Naomi decided to do what many of us would probably do in that situation. She chose to head for home. Her two daughters-in-law began the journey with her. After all, who did the three women have but one another? But Naomi wouldn't hear of it. She urged the two young women to go back to her own homelands and try again. After all, they were young. They could marry again, which would give them renewed hope for family and children. Orpah agreed, but not Ruth. The first words Ruth said in this tragically beautiful story constitute a declaration of such breathtaking love and loyalty that they are still used today as an expression of ultimate devotion. Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Ruth 1:16 and 17a. You've likely heard these stirring words before, but think about what this really meant for Ruth. She was completely disavowing her former life and pledging to commit to a new country. That's why I said in the beginning, here you will hear and you will understand the immigration process. And for those who immigrate, like as I did from Europe to the United States, it's a process that's not easy if you do it completely the right way. It's difficult. You have to make a lot of decisions. You have to leave a lot behind. But you don't abandon your own family as I did. So I even started many years ago my own community, which I named the House of Ruth. So I deeply know very well how this story came to me, and I'll make the decision that I knew that God had a plan for me in the United States, and I came. It was a process from close to, you see, the religious workers visa and all that was close to 8 years before the process is finished to have your green card. So here in the 21st century, and then we look back in the time of Ruth. So for me, it's an honor to talk about this wonderful, indeed superstar woman who made the choice to leave everything behind, and she probably never went back. I visit my own family on a regular basis as much as I can, because I have daughters and grandsons and friends, and my community, which I Zoom twice a week. So there's a lot about to think about for you who hear all this, because maybe one day, a long time ago, you also did the process to come to another country in an immigration process. You don't do it alone. You need to think about everything. And God is the planner. At least it was for me. So that's why I always welcome everyone to my podcast. For everyone is welcome to hear what I have to say. So let's move forward with this beautiful story. But I'm always touched very deeply in my soul if I do something with Ruth, or I hear people working hard for the immigration process and their journey with God. So she was completely disavowing her former life and pledging to commit to a new country, a new home, a new people, even a new religious affiliation. It's truly remarkable. So together, Ruth and Naomi journeyed to Naomi's home country of Judea and to her home city of Bethlehem. And Bethlehem means Beth is house, Lehem is bread, so it is bread house. Here is where an observant reader will sit up and take notice. And I hope that I have observant listeners. and take notice, because this is the first mention of Bethlehem in the Bible. To an ancient Jew reading this story, or listening it now, the significance of the city is obvious. This is the city of David's birth, the home of the great king. But to a Christian reading this story or listen to this story, the city is much more than the home of an earthly king. It is the birthplace of the eternal King Jesus. Ancient Christians writers associate the Hebrew meaning of the city's name, as just said it, house of bread, with Jesus, the true bread from heaven. Bethlehem is where the whole salvation story begins. So as Christians listening or reading the story of Ruth, we know to pay attention. Everything that Bethlehem will come to mean for us begins right here. When a grieving immigrant woman follows her mother-in-law into a strange city, the decision to create a new family, despite the lack of a blood connection, is an important one. And it's a theme this story returns to again and again. So much of the Bible's narratives is focused on biological family and the importance of having one's own children. It's what drives Sarah and Rachel, and as we will see later, further on, Hannah and countless other men and women in the Bible to fall on their faces before God in prayer, begging for children of their own. Throughout the Old Testament, children are often viewed as the single greatest blessing. And we have the book of Ruth showing us that even when that option seems out of reach, God is always weaving together the unexpected. So Ruth and Naomi are a family formed by Ruth's selfless choice. And by the end of the story, their love will have expanded outward to create even more family. And Ruth will eventually be hailed as better to you than 7 sons. But we're not there yet. So, when Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem, they were destitute. Ruth joined in doing what the poor of that time and region did, which was to gather up the scraps of barley left in the field after the reapers had moved through. Every field must have had impoverished people just like them hanging on to its margin, waiting for stray talks of grain to fall. In Leviticus 19 verses 9 to 10, we see God's directive to leave the edges of fields unharvested in order to help the impoverished. Excuse me. After a while, maybe the local people got used to seeing Ruth the same way those of us who live in cities take the presence of the urban poor for granted. How often do our eyes glaze over all that approach of a dirty, shabby panhandler? If we think of them at all, do we wonder before quickly looking away if their own bad choices led them there? Boaz was one of those wealthy landowners, a close relative to Naomi, but to him the poor gleaners were not invisible. He saw a new face among them and asked who she was. When he found out that this was the loyal young woman who journeyed to Bethlehem with Naomi, he insisted that she be given a protected place among the female gleaners. and that she be allowed water along with the reapers. This was counter to the culture in numerous ways. Boaz was giving a foreigner, a woman, preferential treatment. Ruth was astonished at this generosity and asked Boaz why on earth he would show her such gracious favor. Boaz's answer was simple. He was kind to Ruth because he had heard of her humble kindness. In Ruth 2, we find yet another passage of compassionate words when they are needed most. Boaz says to Ruth, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth 2, 11-12. Scripture often shows us God favoring those willing to leave everything for his sake. What was the very first command God gave Abraham? Go from your country, your people and your father's household, God said, to the land I will show you. Genesis 12, verse 1. It's as if God sometimes has to pry us out of our comfort zones before he can accomplish his purposes through us. We often need to be jostled into a radical dependence on God before we can make real spiritual progress. When Naomi found out about Boaz's extraordinary kindness to Ruth, she hatched a plan, Ruth's marriage to him. After all, Boaz was a relative of Naomi's husband, which made him a kinsman to her daughter-in-law as well. In this position, Boaz could act as a kinsman redeemer, someone willing to marry a kinsman widow and restore her position in the family. Marrying the wealthy Boaz would have been a life-changing event for an impoverished immigrant like Ruth. Naomi's plan seemed sound, but it all depended on Boaz's consent, and he could have several reasons to say no. For one thing, as we saw in the story of Tamar, marrying a woman only to have her son not count as your own for inheritance purpose was a difficult, selfless choice. Most men wanted their own wife with their own children, who would inherit their property and carry on their name. That aside, why would Boaz marry a woman who was a stranger in his country? She had no powerful family connections who could help him professionally, and there would be no advantage to him at all in such a match. He had every legitimate reason to refuge. Maybe the next part of Naomi's plan was intended to give Boaz an out, if he wanted one. Ruth, a humble woman, was careful not to put Boaz in an embarrassing public situation. During this joyful time of harvest, Boaz was sleeping on the threshing room floor with his men, likely after a party celebrating the harvest. Ruth 3, verse 7. tells us that Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits. I don't have to explain that, right? He stretched out near a heap of grain excuse me, and closed his eyes to relax. Satisfied with a good day's work, following Naomi's plan, Ruth crept in, silently curled up at his feet, and waited. She waited all night long. Was she nervous, anxiously watching for any sign that Boaz was stirring and would soon find her there? Or was her heart at peace, given that she was in the presence of a man who had already shown her incredible kindness? What would Boaz do when he woke up and found her there? He was kind to her in broad daylight when other people were watching. Would he be different in the dark, where she alone would be privy to his momentous decision? She was a stranger, an immigrant, a Gentile, an outsider. Naomi considered her family, but that didn't actually make her a blood relative. Boaz had no obligations to her, not really. So, what did Boaz say when he awoke and found her there? "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run away after younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." Ruth 3:10-11. Against all odds, Ruth found security and happiness. Boaz responded to the nobility of her nature. He was clearly deeply impressed by her. He married her, but not before another interesting twist, one that returns us once again to the theme of choice. Another unnamed male relative of Naomi's had first right of refusal of Naomi's property and her daughter-in-law. It would be a choice with lifelong consequences. Boaz alerted the man to a piece of land belonging to the late Elimelech, a parcel Naomi hoped to sell. Though the man was interested in the land, when Boaz revealed that its sale would be contingent upon his taking Ruth in marriage, he declined. "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate," he says in Ruth 4:6. Excuse me. Something tickles my throat. Who knows what eventually came of that man? We don't even know his name, because he glides out of the story of salvation, unknown forever. He passed on marrying Ruth. Ruth, the ancestor of King David. I'm sorry, I'm really disturbing this podcast. He passed on marrying Ruth.